Tonight, we begin a long, quiet journey into the distant past. A past filled with rulers, crowns, and thrones, yet also filled with silence, dust, and time. A journey through the rise and fall of mighty kings. But instead of rushing to great battles or legendary conquests, let us move slowly, carefully, like walking barefoot across ancient stone. We will look at kings not as heroes carved in marble, but as human beings, tired, cautious, uncertain, and very often afraid. We start at the very beginning, long before castles, long before golden crowns, even before written history, at a time when the idea of kingship was not yet clear, but slowly, like mist rising at dawn, began to take shape. Imagine a small tribe, thousands of years ago, somewhere in the fertile valleys of the Near East. There are no cities yet, only clusters of huts made of mud and reeds. The people gather each evening around a fire. They tell stories, share food, and make decisions together. But eventually, decisions become harder. The fields must be divided fairly. Hunters must be chosen. When two families argue over land or water, someone must decide. And so, a leader is chosen. Sometimes the strongest hunter, sometimes the elder with the longest memory, sometimes the man or woman believed to speak with spirits. At first, leadership is temporary. The tribe accepts one figure during a hunt or a ritual, and then, after, everyone returns to equality. But slowly, over generations, leadership hardens into permanence. The tribe grows larger, the disputes become greater, and the people decide it is easier, safer, to always have one figure above the rest. This is the very seed of kingship. A single figure who claims authority, and a community that agrees to let them hold it. By the year 3000 BCE, cities were rising in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kishul, names that once rang with power, though today they lie quiet beneath the sand. Here, kingship became something more than leadership. It was wrapped in religion, bound to temples, and carved into clay tablets. The king was not simply a man who ruled. He was the chosen of the gods. He was the keeper of order, the one who stood between heaven and earth. And yet, for all the divine claims, his life was made of small, ordinary details. Picture, if you will, the palace of an early Mesopotamian king. Its walls are made of mud brick, thick to keep out the heat of the sun. The floors are swept clean by servants. The air smells faintly of oil and baked clay. At dawn, the king awakens, not alone, but surrounded by attendants. One brings water for washing. Another carries freshly baked bread. Another stands ready with robes dyed in muted colors. The king eats slowly, dipping bread into a bowl of dates and honey. Perhaps a cup of beer is brought, thick and sweet, brewed from barley. When he is finished, he does not leave the chamber casually. Every movement of the king is formal. Every gesture is watched. To his people, even the act of standing up from bed has meaning. Soon, the king takes his seat upon a low throne. It is not made of gold, not yet. More often wood, decorated with carvings or simple inlays. He sits, and the hall fills with petitioners. One man complains that his neighbor has stolen a goat. Another insists that his boundary stone was moved in the night. Two brothers argue over the division of an inheritance. The king listens, He weighs the words of scribes who read records from clay tablets. He considers the judgment of priests who warn of the God's will. And then he speaks. A short sentence, a nod, perhaps the lift of a hand, and with that the matter is settled. This, more than war or conquest, is the daily rhythm of kingship, endless disputes, endless decisions, a life spent listening, deciding, and declaring to his people. The king may seem mighty, untouchable, almost divine, but within himself, he knows the burden is heavy. If the harvest fails, the blame falls upon him. If floods destroy the fields, whispers spread that the gods are displeased with their king. If enemies raid the city, the people mutter that perhaps a stronger man should wear the crown. And so the king eats carefully, lest his food be poisoned. He sleeps lightly, his bed surrounded by guards. Even among his closest advisers, he does not fully trust. The crown, though made of metal, is felt as a weight upon the soul. History tells us of kings who ruled for decades, but for every long reign, there were many short ones. A young warrior might gather followers, storm the palace, and seize the throne. A priest might declare that the gods had withdrawn their blessing, and the people would rise in revolt. Sometimes, the king's own family turned against him, sons against fathers, brothers against brothers. In time, the once mighty king would be forgotten. His palace would crumble. His name would fade from memory, written only on tablets buried deep beneath the earth. This was the fate of kings, to rise, to rule, and to vanish. And so it went, not only in Mesopotamia, but in Egypt, in China, in the Indus Valley, and beyond. The same pattern. A tribe chooses a leader becomes a king. The king claims divine favor. The people obey. And then, slowly, inevitably, the king is replaced. The cycle repeats, again and again, across centuries. Each time, the new king believes himself eternal. Each time, he builds walls, monuments, and palaces to secure his memory. And each time, the sand and the wind prove stronger than stone. And so, in this first part of our long journey, we have seen how kingship was born, from small tribes to cities of clay to thrones of wood and stone. We have seen that kingship was not always glory. It was often duty, repetition, and fear. It was listening to complaints, judging quarrels, and bearing the heavy belief that the gods had placed the world upon one man's shoulders. As we move forward, we will follow kings into Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. We will see their ceremonies, their meals, their palaces, and their falls. We will see that no matter how mighty, every king eventually bowed before time. But for now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the thought of distant palaces fade like torchlight, dying in the night. And remember, even the greatest rulers, with all their power, knew the slow rhythm of days, the weight of decisions, and the certainty that nothing lasts forever. The torchlight flickers against the mud-brick walls of another palace, this time not in Mesopotamia, but along the wide, endless river that flows through Egypt. The Nile, calm and steady, rises and falls with the seasons. And for thousands of years, it gave birth to one of the most enduring kingdoms in history. Here, kings were not simply rulers. They were more than leaders, more than men with crowns. They were pharaohs, living gods upon the earth, worshipped in temples, feared by enemies, and remembered in stone. But as with all kings, their lives were still made of small, ordinary things, waking, eating, walking through shaded courtyards, listening to disputes, growing older with each passing season. To the outside world, the pharaoh seemed eternal, as if carved from stone himself. Yet within the palace, behind the ritual and the splendor, his days were quiet, repetitive, and full of human detail. Each morning, long before the city stirred, the pharaoh's attendants entered his chamber. The rising sun cast pale light through slits in the walls, and the room filled with the smell of burning incense. Servants spoke in hushed tones, for waking the pharaoh was not simply a matter of shaking him from sleep. It was a ritual. To cleanse his body was to cleanse the kingdom itself. Basins of cool water, drawn from the Nile and scented with oils, were carried in. The pharaoh's face and hands were washed, and his body was rubbed with perfumed ointments. Robes of fine linen, soft and white, were draped carefully over his shoulders. Gold jewelry was placed upon his chest and wrists, not only for decoration, but for protection, as each piece carried meaning, invoking gods who guarded him from harm. When he was dressed, priests entered the chamber. They bowed deeply before him, murmuring prayers that tied his breath to the breath of the gods. Their voices echoed softly against the stone, low and steady, as though they were weaving a fabric of words around the pharaoh. Only then, once the rituals were complete, was he ready to greet the day. Breakfast came on trays of reed and wood, flat bread baked from emmer wheat, sweetened with honey, flavored with figs and dates. There might be cuts of roasted meat or fresh fruit gathered from orchards, a cup of beer, thick and filling, or wine diluted with water, cooled in clay jars. This meal was taken in silence. Servants stood nearby, waiting to refill bowls, but conversation was rare. Every act of the pharaoh, even eating, was seen as sacred performance. And so he ate slowly, deliberately, as though each bite connected him to the order of the universe. When the meal was finished, the business of kingship began. Courtiers entered the halls of the palace, carrying scrolls of papyrus. Messengers arrived with news from towns and villages far down the Nile. A farmer might plead for tax relief after a poor harvest. A governor might request more soldiers to defend against raiders. Priests demanded resources for temples, insisting that the gods required new offerings. The flow of voices was constant, and the pharaoh's task was always the same: to listen, to consider, and to decide. Though his throne was gilded with gold and decorated with inlays of precious stone, though he wore the tall crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt united, the rhythm of his day was not always glory. Much of it was administration, the slow work of keeping the kingdom in order. He signed decrees, he listened to scribes, he spoke brief judgments that carried the weight of life and death. Beyond the walls of the palace, there were rituals of state to perform. The pharaoh walked in solemn processions through great temples, his steps measured and deliberate. Musicians plucked harps and flutes, while dancers moved in steady rhythm. Priests chanted hymns that had been spoken for centuries, their voices filling the air with repetition. Clouds of incense drifted upward, heavy and sweet, coating the air until it seemed one could taste it. Every gesture of the pharaoh was symbolic. When he lifted a cup of wine to pour an offering, it was not simply an act of pouring, but the renewal of cosmic order. When he spoke a blessing, It was not simply words, but a command that bound the world together. Even standing still, silent, and unmoving, his presence was believed to maintain balance between earth and heaven. And yet, for all this ritual, for all this ceremony, there was fragility beneath the surface. The pharaoh knew it well. His power, as solid as it seemed, rested on belief. If the Nile rose too high, drowning the fields, people questioned his favor with the gods. If it rose too little, starving the crops, whispers spread that the pharaoh had failed in his sacred duty. If enemies pressed too hard at the borders, if soldiers returned defeated, voices in the night began to murmur that another man might rule better. This was the silent burden of kingship. A crown was not only heavy on the head, it was heavy on the heart. Meals were tasted before the pharaoh ate them, lest poison lie hidden in the bread or wine. Servants were chosen carefully, trusted through bloodlines or sworn oaths, yet still watched closely. Guards stood at every corner of the palace, not only to protect against intruders, but to watch those already within. Even family members were a source of worry. A son eager for the throne, a brother with ambition, a cousin whispering discontent. In the long corridors of power, trust was always thin. And so the pharaoh lived both as a god and as a prisoner, worshipped in public, guarded in private, adored in temples, but alone in his chamber at night. The monuments that rose in his name, pyramids, temples, colossal statues carved from stone, were not built only from pride. They were built from fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of vanishing into the sands of time, fear that the people would one day stop believing in his divinity. To carve one's name deep into stone was to resist that fear. To build a pyramid was to command eternity itself to remember. And yet, eternity has its own patience. Sand drifted over temples, wind scoured inscriptions, tombs were broken open, treasures stolen, names erased. What had once seemed eternal became fragile. What had once been carved to last forever became broken, scattered, and silent. Outside the palace, life continued in its own rhythm. Farmers bent over fields, their bodies burned by the sun, planting and harvesting in cycles that never ended. To them, the pharaoh was distant, almost unreal. A figure glimpsed only in ceremonies, carried high above the crowd, shining in gold and white linen. For them, he was less a man and more an idea, a living symbol of order. But within the palace, walls, servants saw the human side. They saw him tired at the end of the day, slumping into a chair. They saw him frown at difficult decisions. They saw his hands tremble with age, his steps slow with the weight of years. To them, he was still a man wrapped in ritual, but a man nonetheless. As night fell, the palace grew quiet. Oil lamps flickered in the corridors, casting long shadows on the walls. The sound of insects drifted in from the riverbanks. In the stillness, the pharaoh might sit alone, gazing at the faint glow of the stars through a narrow window. Perhaps he wondered if the gods truly watched over him. Perhaps he thought of his ancestors, once mighty, now names on crumbling walls. Perhaps he felt the loneliness of power, the silence that comes when every voice around you speaks in praise. But few speak in truth. He lay down to sleep, guarded by soldiers at his door, his chamber sealed and silent. Yet even then, sleep did not always come easily. The crown weighed heavily, even when removed. Dreams might come of floods or famine, of betrayal, of enemies crossing deserts with swords raised high. And when he woke, the rituals would begin again: washing, anointing, dressing, eating, listening, deciding. The same cycle repeated each day, as though the kingdom itself depended upon his every gesture, and in truth, to the people, it did. His presence was not only leadership, but the very balance of the universe. To lose him was to risk disorder. To replace him was to risk collapse. And yet, despite all ritual, despite all belief, despite all the monuments raised in his name, the pharaoh, too, would one day die. His body would be embalmed, wrapped in linen, placed in a tomb with treasures meant to sustain him in the afterlife. Priests would chant, incense would burn, offerings would be made, and then, after days of ritual, the tomb would be sealed. Time would move forward. Another would take his place. Another pharaoh would rise, claiming the same divine favor, wearing the same crowns, speaking the same rituals. And slowly, the memory of the one before would fade. His monuments would weather. His name would be less often spoken. And eventually, he would become just one among many, a fragment in the long story of kings. This was the truth of kingship in Egypt as in Mesopotamia. Beneath the crowns, beneath the titles, beneath the ceremonies, kings were men who woke at dawn, ate their meals, listened to disputes, and carried fears into the night. They were worshipped as gods, but they lived with the fragility of human lives. And so the cycle continued. Kings rose, ruled, and fell. The Nile kept flowing. The sun kept rising. And time, endless and patient, moved on. The sands shift again, and we leave the banks of the Nile to return eastward to the broad plains of Mesopotamia. Time has passed. The first city-states of Sumer have risen and fallen. Now new powers emerge, names carved into history with stronger strokes: Babylon, Assyria, kingdoms that once cast their shadow across half the known world. Their kings called themselves mighty, their armies marched far, their walls stretched high, and yet, for all the strength they claimed, their lives too were shaped by quiet routines, by long days of listening and judging, and by the knowledge that power, no matter how vast, was always fragile. The city of Babylon, with its broad avenues and tall temples, was said to be one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its kings were remembered in myths that blurred into legend. Hammurabi, who ordered laws to be carved in stone so that no man could say he did not know the rules. Nebuchadnezzar, who built gardens that seemed to float above the ground, terraces of green rising against the dusty horizon. To walk its streets was to feel the hum of empire, the bustle of merchants, the chants of priests, the presence of soldiers. But within the palace, where the king dwelled, life was once again a mixture of ceremony and ordinary habit. The palace walls rose high, plastered and painted, their gates watched by guards day and night. Inside, courtyards opened to the sky, their floors paved with baked brick. Servants hurried through, carrying jars of water, baskets of bread, platters of roasted meat. Scribes bent over tablets of wet clay, pressing wedges with their styluses, recording every order, every tax, every name. Priests moved with solemn expressions, their lips murmuring prayers to the gods of storm and sun, of river and sky. The king rose each morning to the sound of instruments, flutes, drums, or harps played softly to honor the dawn. He was washed in scented water, his skin rubbed with oils, his beard combed carefully, braided in the style of kings. Heavy robes, woven with bright dyes, were placed upon him, and a diadem of gold or silver was fitted to his brow. Even these acts, so ordinary to us, were surrounded with ritual, for in Babylon the king was not just a ruler, but the very center of the order of the world. His breakfast might be bread dipped in honey, cheese from goats, fruit from orchards, dates pressed into sweet cakes. A cup of wine was offered, sometimes mixed with herbs. To eat was to give thanks, and priests recited blessings over the meal. Each bite seemed to carry the weight of expectation, as though the fate of the kingdom was tied to the simple act of chewing and swallowing when he was seated upon his throne. The great hall filled with the voices of the day. Ambassadors from distant lands came bearing tribute gems, precious metals, fine textiles, strange animals never before seen in Babylon. Local officials arrived to report on harvests and taxes. Soldiers spoke of border skirmishes, of raids in the hills, of caravans attacked on distant roads. The king listened, one voice after another, his expression carefully still, his replies short but final. To the petitioner, it was life-changing. To the king, it was one more decision among hundreds. In the afternoons, the king often joined priests. In ceremonies, they burned incense before statues of the gods, poured libations of wine, and offered animals in sacrifice. Chants filled the air, repeating words so old that their meanings were half forgotten. To the people, these rituals renewed the balance of heaven and earth. To the king, they were also a reminder of his own role, fragile, necessary, and never secure. Beyond Babylon, another kingdom rose in power, Assyria. Its kings were remembered as warriors, as conquerors who led armies across deserts and mountains, bringing entire nations beneath their rule. Their palaces were decorated with reliefs showing lions hunted, battles won, cities burning. To later generations, they seemed fierce and unstoppable. But within those walls of stone, daily life was again much quieter than legend suggests. The Assyrian king, like his Babylonian counterpart, awoke surrounded by attendants. He, too, was bathed, anointed, dressed in fine robes. His meals were brought on trays of gold and silver, though the food itself was not so different from that of his subjects: bread, meat, fruits, and wine. He sat upon a throne, carved from wood, plated with ivory or bronze. Courtiers gathered, scribes wrote, officials bowed. Disputes were judged, orders given, decrees sealed. The empire stretched far, but the rhythm of rule remained slow and repetitive. Even the kings who led armies into battle did not spend their whole lives in war. Campaigns lasted only part of the year. The rest of their time was spent in palaces, listening to advisors, inspecting records, overseeing the building of walls and temples. Their images on stone showed them always in victory, but their reality was endless meetings, endless reports, endless responsibilities. The crown was no lighter in Assyria than in Babylon, yet the kings of Assyria feared not only enemies beyond their borders, but betrayal within. Assassinations were not rare. Plots brewed in shadows. Brothers, sons, generals, all could be rivals. The king slept, surrounded by guards, his food tasted before he ate, his letters checked for hidden meanings. He ruled through fear, but he also lived in fear. And then, as always, time moved forward. Babylon fell, Assyria fell. Their great cities, once filled with voices, emptied. Their palaces crumbled, their walls collapsed, their statues toppled. The kings who once called themselves mighty became names on broken tablets, fragments in dusty libraries, forgotten except by the patient work of later scholars. The daily routines, the meals, the fears, the decisions, all of it vanished into silence. For all their grandeur, their lives had been much like those of other kings, to rise in glory, to rule in splendor, to carry burdens, and then to fall, leaving only ruins behind. The cycle repeated itself once more, as it always did. And so, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine those distant palaces, now quiet beneath layers of earth. Imagine the faint echo of sandals on stone floors, the low hum of priests chanting, the soft crackle of oil lamps burning in the night. Imagine kings seated on thrones, weary eyes half closed, listening to yet another voice, giving yet another judgment, feeling the weight of eternity upon their shoulders. And then imagine silence as the centuries pass, until nothing remains but the dust. The rise and fall of mighty kings is not a tale of sudden glory and sudden ruin. It is a slow rhythm, a cycle repeated across time. A man rises, is lifted higher than the rest, bears the weight of his people, and then, like all men, he fades, the crown passes, the monuments crumble, the earth remembers nothing. And so, too, will this part of our journey rest, quiet and still, waiting for the next chapter in the long story of kings? The story of kings does not end with Babylon or Assyria. Empires rise, empires fall, and from their ashes new rulers step forward, claiming titles greater than any before them. To the east, across mountains and plains, another power gathered strength. The Persians. They would call their ruler not simply king, but king of kings, a title that tried to gather all others beneath it. When Cyrus rose to power, the old order of Mesopotamia gave way to something wider. His empire stretched across lands that once seemed impossibly distant, from the edge of the Mediterranean to the valleys of India. After him, Darius, then Xerxes, names carved into stone inscriptions, into the memory of those who bowed before them. But for all the size of their empire, the lives of these men were still shaped by the familiar patterns of rule. Rising at dawn, sitting in judgment, listening to endless voices, eating, drinking, and offering prayers to the gods. The Persian court was vast. Unlike the brick palaces of Babylon, the halls of Persepolis and Susa were built with columns that reached high into the sky. Carved stairways showed endless lines of tribute bearers, men from every province bringing gifts, baskets of spices, wool and silk, horses, camels, even lions. To stand before the throne was to see the empire gathered in miniature, each gift a symbol of distant obedience. But to the king himself, it was also routine. Day after day, new faces appeared, new gifts were presented, and the words of loyalty repeated again and again. The mornings began slowly. Servants approached the royal chambers in silence, carrying basins of warm water. The king was washed, his hair and beard carefully combed, his skin anointed with perfumes distilled from flowers. He dressed in robes woven with gold thread, heavy upon the shoulders, bright against the dim morning light. Jewelry was fitted carefully, rings, bracelets, and sometimes a collar of metal that gleamed with gems. Each piece symbolized wealth and dominion, but to the king it was as ordinary as tying a belt. Breakfast, too, was ceremonial. Breads baked from fine flour, fruits preserved from distant orchards, meat roasted slowly over coals, a cup of wine, diluted with water, sometimes flavored with herbs. Each dish represented the reach of empire. Grapes from the west, dates from the south, spices from the east. The king ate, surrounded by attendants, their eyes lowered, their hands steady as they served. To eat was to declare order, to show that the vast lands under Persian control continued. To provide, after the meal, came the duties of the throne. The king seated himself in the great hall, upon a platform high above the floor. Courtiers stood in careful ranks. Scribes waited with tablets of wax and rolls of parchment. Guards stood, with spears crossed. Ambassadors from distant lands stepped forward, their words translated by interpreters, their gifts displayed for all to see. Sometimes their languages were strange, their clothes unusual, their customs unfamiliar. Yet the ritual was the same. They bowed, they offered, they promised loyalty. The king nodded, spoke a few words, and another record was made. It was called the Royal Road, the great highway of Persia, stretching for thousands of miles, connecting the provinces to the heart of power. Messengers rode it swiftly, carrying news of battles, uprisings, or simple reports of harvests. Each day the king heard such reports: grain tallies, tax collections, requests for judgment in disputes. The flow never ended. To us, such details may seem dull, but for the king, they were the pulse of his empire. Each tablet or scroll was a piece of his dominion, and to ignore it was to risk collapse. At times, the king left the hall to inspect his gardens. The Persians loved their walled enclosures of green, where trees were planted in orderly rows and water flowed through channels cut with precision. Shade, fragrance, and the sound of birds offered relief from the heaviness of court life. Here, the king could walk slowly, his hands behind his back, his eyes resting on the colors of flowers. Yet, even here, he was not free from duty. Advisors walked at his side, reading petitions, whispering names, awaiting commands. The gardens were not only for rest, they were a stage where the king showed himself as master of both nature and men. Meals at midday and in the evening were more elaborate. Long tables stretched across the hall, though the king himself dined apart, his seat raised higher. Meat from sheep, cattle, and birds was served, cooked with spices that filled the air. Bowls of fruit and nuts were passed. Dishes of fish, brought from rivers far away, were set upon silver platters. Wine was poured again and again, though always with care. Musicians played softly, plucking strings or blowing flutes, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. To the courtiers, to sit in such banquets was an honor, a sign of favor. To the king, it was often repetition, the same faces, the same music, the same gestures of flattery. To hold power meant to endure these rituals without change. Even joy became routine when repeated each day. In the evenings, the king joined the priests of his faith, offering prayers to the eternal flame. Incense rose, smoke curling toward the sky. Words of ancient hymns were spoken slowly, each syllable carrying weight. The king bowed his head, his hands raised, for in the Persian world, even the king of kings was a servant of a higher order. This acknowledgement reminded him that his authority, vast as it seemed, was still temporary. The Persians built roads, canals, and cities, but like all empires before, their strength faded with time. Armies marched outward, victories won, but defeats to follow. Kings once secure found rebellion at their borders, rival claimants at their gates. Wealth that seemed endless drained away. The same halls that had echoed with tribute one year echoed with worry the next, and slowly, inevitably, the pattern returned. Power grew heavy. The burden pressed down when Alexander came from the west. The Persian kings fell, as surely as the Babylonians and Assyrians had before. The palaces of Persepolis, once filled with ceremony, were set aflame. The columns that had stretched proudly into the sky stood blackened against the horizon. The King of Kings became a fugitive, his court scattered, his rituals broken, and with him the rhythm of Persian rule ended. Yet, even in their fall, the Persians showed us once again the sameness of kings, to rise in glory, to carry the burden of rule, to eat, to judge, to pray, to fear, and then to be forgotten. Their names surviving only in fragments of stone and stories whispered in later centuries. Tonight, as you rest, you may imagine the vast halls of Persepolis, quiet now under the stars. The stairways that once bore tribute from every nation now lead nowhere. The carved reliefs, their lines softened by time, still show endless processions of men who long ago turned to dust. The silence is deep, broken only by the wind, and in that silence lies the truth of all kings. However mighty, however exalted, they too pass away. The rise and fall of mighty kings is a story without end. Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia have risen, all have fallen. Their daily lives, filled with routine and ritual, were once the heartbeat of entire civilizations. Now they are echoes, faint and distant, yet still enough to lull us into reflection, into rest. And so, with this, the first section of our long journey closes. The earliest kings, from river valleys to vast empires, have passed before us. We have seen their thrones, their meals, their prayers, their fears, and we have seen them fall, one by one, into silence. As you drift deeper into sleep, hold this thought gently, that power is always temporary, that time erodes even the mightiest names, and that in the end, kings and commoners alike share the same fate. Quiet, stillness, the long rest of history. The dawn of a new age came with the rising of the sun over the Aegean Sea. The waters glimmered, the waves gentle against the rocky shores. Here, in the scattered lands of Greece, kingship took on new forms. It was not the vast empire of Babylon, nor the towering monuments of Egypt, nor even the sprawling order of Persia. Instead, it was a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own traditions, its own fragile hold upon power. The earliest kings of Greece were remembered, in song more than in stone. They lived in palaces of stone and mud brick, halls decorated not with towering columns, but with painted walls and storerooms filled with jars of oil and wine. These were the Mycenaean kings, whose names echoed in the poetry of Homer: Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, whether they were real men or legends embroidered over centuries, hardly mattered. In the memory of Greece, they stood as kings who led their people in war, in feast, and in sacrifice. Their daily lives were far from the battlefield epics later sung about them. At dawn, servants would approach the royal chambers with water carried in bronze vessels. The king was washed, his hair combed, his garments laid out, unlike the golden crowns of Egypt or the jeweled robes of Persia. The Mycenaean king wore simpler attire, though still marked by finery beyond the reach of common men. Wool dyed deep red or purple, a cloak fastened with a pin of bronze or gold, leather sandals upon his feet. Breakfast was a modest meal. Bread baked from barley or wheat, cheese from sheep or goats, olives, and perhaps dried figs. A cup of watered wine might accompany it, for in Greece, wine was a daily drink, not a rare luxury. To eat was to begin the day with stability, a reminder that the storerooms were full, that the harvest had been good, that the household remained in order. The king's duties stretched beyond his hall. He listened to disputes among his people, sat in judgment over matters of land and inheritance, heard complaints of theft or violence. Like the kings of Mesopotamia, he was a judge as much as a ruler. The scribe or herald recorded decisions, though in those days much was still passed on by memory, words carried from mouth to ear, trusted to the recollection of men rather than stone tablets. In the afternoons, the king might walk the courtyards of his palace, where artisans worked, hammering bronze into weapons or tools, potters shaping clay upon the wheel, weavers at their looms. These were the labors that sustained a kingdom, and though the king rarely touched such work himself, he understood that his rule depended upon their steady rhythm. A sword well forged meant security. A pot well baked meant food preserved. Cloth well woven meant warmth in the winter months. Meals were taken with companions, often warriors who owed loyalty to the king. Roasted meat from cattle or sheep was shared. Wine poured in cups. Songs sung to the sound of the lyre. To feast was not only to eat, but to display unity, to bind men together in loyalty. Yet these feasts, so often remembered in legend as grand and heroic, were in reality repetitive affairs, much like the banquets of other lands. The same dishes, the same toasts, the same songs, repeated over and over until they blurred together in memory. Sacrifice to the gods was a central act. Animals were led to altars, their throats cut, the smoke of burning flesh rising to the heavens. The king stood by, offering prayers, for in Greece, the ruler was both warrior and priest, responsible for maintaining favor with the divine. Without the blessing of the gods, crops might fail, enemies might triumph, storms might strike. Rituals were old, their words passed down unchanged, their meanings sometimes fading, but the repetition itself gave comfort. Over time, the Mycenaean world collapsed. Palaces burned, trade routes vanished, and Greece fell into centuries of silence. When it emerged again, kings were fewer, their power limited. In many cities, councils of elders or assemblies of citizens replaced the authority of a single man. Yet in some places, kingship endured, though stripped of its former glory. In Sparta, for example, 2 kings ruled at once, their power balanced by laws and traditions that kept them from absolute authority. The daily life of a Spartan king was simpler than that of an Eastern monarch. He lived with discipline, ate meals of barley broth, trained alongside soldiers, and joined in the harsh rhythms of a militarized society. His crown was lighter, but his burden was no less heavy, for the expectations of his people pressed upon him from dawn until dusk. Elsewhere, in Greece, kings became little more than ceremonial figures, remembered for festivals and sacrifices, but stripped of true command. In Athens, democracy rose, and kingship faded into memory, replaced by magistrates and assemblies. Yet even here, the echoes of monarchy remained, for the rituals of kingship had carved deep grooves into the lives of men. To be a Greek king in these shifting times was to live in uncertainty. One day, honored with feasts and songs; another, challenged by councils or pushed aside by assemblies. The throne, once a seat of divine power, became a chair that could be taken away. And so, the daily life of kings grew quieter, smaller, more fragile. Still, the patterns endured. Rising in the morning, washing, dressing, eating, listening to disputes, leading ceremonies, presiding over feasts. The crown, though lighter, remained a weight. The sense of fragility, of impermanence, pressed upon each ruler. They had seen the ruins of the palaces before them. They knew how easily greatness fell to dust. The kings of Greece, whether sung of in epics or remembered only in faint inscriptions, shared the same rhythm of existence as all kings before them. Ceremony and repetition, judgment and fear, prayer and silence. Their names, like those of Sumer and Egypt, Babylon and Persia, might echo for a time, but in the end, even they faded. As you rest now, imagine the small palaces upon rocky hills, their walls of stone warmed by the sun, their hearths glowing with steady flames. Picture the king walking slowly through a courtyard, pausing to watch the smith hammer his bronze, the potter turn his wheel, the weaver move her shuttle back and forth. Picture the hall filled with the low hum of voices, the clatter of cups, the rising of a song that drifts into the night, and then picture the silence that followed. As palaces crumbled, as cities shifted, as crowns grew lighter and then vanished altogether, the cycle continued, as it always did, reminding us once again that kings rise, they rule, they fall, and they are forgotten. The rise and fall of mighty kings never ends. It flows onward, across seas and centuries, carrying us from one shore to another, from one throne to the next. The Tiber River flowed quietly, winding its way through gentle hills and marshy plains. Along its banks rose a small settlement, little more than huts of wood and straw. In time, it would grow into the city of Rome, but long before legions marched and emperors reigned, Rome was ruled by kings. Their names were remembered in chronicles. Whether they lived exactly as the stories tell is uncertain, but their shadows shaped the Roman memory of kingship. To imagine the life of these early kings is to picture a man both simple and ceremonial. He woke at dawn, as farmers did, for Rome was still young, and its people worked the land. Servants lit small fires, brought water from nearby wells, and prepared bread baked from coarse grain. The king's breakfast was little different from that of his people: bread, cheese, perhaps olives or figs when the season allowed. Wine, diluted with water, was served sparingly in the mornings. Clothing was plain, though dignified, a tunic of wool belted at the waist. Over it, a cloak, the toga, simple yet symbolic. Colors might distinguish his status. The purple-bordered toga, reserved for kings and later magistrates. Upon his head, a wreath of laurel or a simple band of cloth could serve as a crown. Unlike the golden diadems of Persia or the towering crowns of Egypt, the Roman king's adornments were modest, reflecting the humility of a people who still lived close to the soil. The king's duties began early. He sat in a small hall, not yet the marble palaces of later centuries, but a wooden structure where citizens gathered. Petitioners came with disputes over fields, boundaries, debts, and inheritance. The king listened, spoke judgments, and pronounced decisions. His word carried the weight of law, though his authority was balanced by the council of elders, the Senate, whose advice shaped the early kingdom. Sacred duties filled much of his day. The Romans believed deeply in ritual, and the king was both ruler and high priest. Each action was accompanied by prayers, each decision framed by signs from the gods. At dawn, augurs observed the flight of birds, their patterns in the sky interpreted as omens. Priests sacrificed animals, examining their entrails for signs of favor or warning. The king himself offered prayers, his voice steady, repeating words passed down for generations. The act of sacrifice was both political and divine. To neglect it would endanger not only the ruler, but the entire city. In the afternoons, the king might join his people in festivals. Processions wound through the streets, carrying statues of the gods. Musicians played flutes and drums, children ran alongside, and offerings of grain and wine were poured. At times, games were held, chariot races on simple tracks, athletic contests in open fields. The king presided, seated on a raised platform, watching as his people cheered. For him, the games were less about amusement and more about display, a reminder that he was the center of the community, the figure around whom order revolved. Feasts were held in the evenings. Tables were laid with roasted meat, spork, lamb, or beef, accompanied by bread, beans, lentils, and vegetables from gardens. Wine flowed more freely, mixed with water, flavored with herbs. The king dined with nobles, his companions in war and peace. Songs were sung, tales of ancestors retold, stories of battles fought and victories won. The firelight flickered against the walls, shadows dancing, voices rising in steady rhythm. These feasts, repeated night after night, reinforced the bonds between ruler and subjects, even as they became predictable, almost monotonous. The kings of Rome were remembered not only for their daily habits, but for their legacies. Romulus, the founder, was said to have built the first walls and established the Senate. Numa, his successor, was remembered for peace, for organizing religious rites, for teaching the Romans to honor the gods with regularity. Tullus was remembered for war, Ancus for building, Tarquinius for wealth, Servius for reform, and finally, Tarquinius Superbus, the proud one, for arrogance and cruelty. Each left a mark, but each also lived a life bound by routine: waking, eating, praying, judging, feasting, and sleeping. Even in their supposed grandeur, the kings of Rome were surrounded by uncertainty. They ruled over a people wary of tyranny, a people who valued independence and feared the excesses of monarchy. The Senate watched them closely. Nobles whispered, rivals waited. Assassination and exile were constant risks. The crown, such as it was, sat uneasily upon their brows. When the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was cast out, Rome declared itself a republic. The monarchy ended, but the memory of kingship lingered. The Romans kept the rituals, but stripped them of royal authority. They appointed priests to perform the sacred duties once reserved for kings. They elected magistrates to command armies and judge disputes. They vowed never again to suffer the rule of a single man. Yet they carried forward the habits and forms of monarchy in new clothes. To imagine the evenings of an early Roman king is to picture him sitting quietly after a feast, the fire burning low, the voices fading. Outside, the Tiber flowed steadily, its waters dark under the moonlight. The huts of his people stood in silence, their hearths glowing faintly. Dogs barked in the distance. The king laid aside his wreath, unfastened his cloak, and lay down to rest. For all his titles and duties, his body was weary, his mind heavy, his future uncertain. And then, as centuries passed, his memory too faded. His name became a story, a tale told by later Romans to explain their beginnings, the daily acts of his life, the bread he ate, the prayers he spoke, the judgments he made, were forgotten, as all such details are. What remained was the pattern, the rise, the rule, the fall. The story of Rome's kings is not one of endless glory, but of quiet repetition. They lived as men do, they ruled as men must, and they were remembered as men rarely are. Yet even their memory did not escape the erosion of time. As you rest now, imagine the wooden halls of early Rome, the flicker of torches against rough walls, the murmur of voices rising and falling. Imagine the king seated on a simple chair, listening to petitions, raising his hand in judgment, lowering his head in prayer. Imagine the slow rhythm of his days, the weight of his crown, the uncertainty of his rule. And then, as sleep draws near, imagine the silence that followed the end of kingship, the birth of a republic, the slow fading of royal names into dust. The rise and fall of mighty kings continues, as it always has. Rome moved beyond monarchy, but the cycle endured, waiting for the next crown to be lifted, the next throne to be claimed. The young prince of Macedon rose early, as he had been taught since childhood. His attendants entered quietly, opening the shutters to let in the pale morning light. They brought water for washing, laying out garments of fine wool and linen, dyed in deep purples and rich reds. At his side, a sword rested, simple in design but balanced in the hand, a companion for training and battle. This prince was Alexander, the son of Philip, born into a court of ambition, strategy, and endless preparation. The palace at Pella was no vast marble structure, but it was filled with activity. Courtiers whispered in corridors, guards stood at attention, and servants hurried with trays of bread, figs, and honey. From his earliest years, Alexander's life was marked by routine. Tutors drilled him in reading, writing, and mathematics. Philosophers recited lessons on ethics and politics. Most famously, Aristotle himself instructed him in science, poetry, and philosophy, shaping a mind that was both curious and restless. Yet alongside the study of words came the discipline of the body: wrestling, riding, spear throwing, archery. Day, he trained his limbs for war. When he was still a boy, stories of heroes filled his imagination. He listened to tales of Achilles, the warrior of Troy, and carried a copy of Homer's epic with him always. He dreamed of conquest, of surpassing the deeds of those who came before. This dreaming did not fade as he grew older. It deepened, becoming the rhythm of his life. Breakfasts were simple. From Macedonians valued endurance. A crust of bread, cheese from goats, dried fruits, perhaps watered wine. Then came the morning exercises, mounting horses, charging across fields, throwing javelins at targets, sparring with companions. Sweat and dust covered their bodies, the air filled with shouts and laughter. After training, Alexander joined his father Philip in councils of war, where maps were spread on tables and plans laid for campaigns. From these moments, he absorbed the lessons of power: when to march, when to wait, when to strike, and when to make peace. When Philip died, Alexander inherited more than a throne. He inherited a restless kingdom, ambitious nobles, and enemies who doubted him. Yet he moved swiftly, cutting down rivals, securing loyalty, and taking command of the armies his father had built. The crown upon his head was light in weight, but heavy in responsibility. His days became even more structured: councils at dawn, sacrifices to the gods, reviews of soldiers, and preparations for endless marches. The march eastward began with routine. Soldiers gathered, weapons checked, rations loaded. The camps stretched for miles, tents arranged in careful order. Alexander moved among them, speaking to common soldiers, sharing their meals, sleeping under the same canvas as his men. At dawn, horns sounded, and the army advanced, dust rising in steady clouds. Each day brought repetition: walking, riding, eating, sleeping. Each night, fires lit the darkness, men murmured prayers, and Alexander planned the next day's movements. Battles came, but between them lay long stretches of monotony. Weeks of marching across plains, months of enduring heat or rain. Soldiers grew weary, horses limped, carts broke. Supplies ran low, and the same meals of barley bread and dried meat became tiresome. Yet Alexander's presence kept the rhythm alive. He walked with them, ate with them, encouraged them. He too endured the dust, the sweat, the waiting. When victories came, they were marked with rituals. Sacrifices were made to the gods, processions held, feasts arranged. The king presided, his face solemn yet proud. At such feasts, tables were filled with roasted meats, baskets of bread, jugs of wine. Musicians played, poets recited verses, companions told stories of battles fought. The soldiers cheered, drinking late into the night. But even in these moments of celebration, the structure of routine persisted. The next morning brought the same duties: prayers at dawn, inspections, preparations for another march. The further east they went, the stranger the lands became. Rivers wider than any in Macedon, cities with walls that touched the sky, temples filled with unfamiliar gods. Alexander adapted, blending customs, honoring local deities, dressing in new garments. He sought to unite rather than divide, to be seen not only as conqueror but as king. Each adaptation became part of his daily life. He learned new rituals, new forms of greeting, new ways of ruling. The mornings still began with offerings, the evenings still ended with councils, but the details changed, shaped by the lands he entered. When he reached Babylon, the routines of kingship took on new grandeur. The palace there was vast, its halls decorated with painted tiles, its gardens lush with trees and flowing water. Attendants carried golden vessels, incense burned in steady streams, musicians filled the air with soft notes. Yet even in such splendor, Alexander's days remained bound to repetition. Rising early, speaking with generals, meeting with envoys, issuing decrees, dining with companions, retiring late. But the pace of conquest and rule took its toll. Nights grew restless, fevers came and went. The weight of expectation pressed heavier. Each year, Alexander sought relief in feasting, in drinking, in endless plans for new campaigns. Still, he dreamed of reaching further, of marching to the ends of the earth. His body weakened, but his ambition did not. In the end, he died, not on the battlefield, but in the palace at Babylon. The details remain uncertain. Perhaps fever, perhaps poison, perhaps exhaustion. He was still young, barely 33, yet already a legend. His body lay in a chamber filled with incense, his companions weeping, his soldiers silent. His empire, so vast and sudden, stretched from Greece to India. But his crown, heavy with expectation, could not rest on any one head. After him, for with his death came division. Generals claimed territories, each seeking to be king in his own right. The empire fractured, giving birth to the Hellenistic kingdoms of Egypt, Syria, and beyond. These new rulers imitated Alexander's routines, sacrifices at dawn, councils at midday, feasts at night, but without his unifying presence, their reigns were fragile. Wars broke out, thrones changed hands, dynasties rose and fell. Yet still, the rhythm of daily life for kings continued, steady, repetitive, binding one generation to the next. The kings of the Hellenistic age built palaces, founded cities, patronized scholars, and commissioned statues. They dined on rich foods, wore silks and jewels, and entertained poets and philosophers. But beneath the surface, their days were little different from those of kings before. Rising early, hearing disputes, making sacrifices, leading armies, holding feasts, and retiring to rest. The cycle repeated again and again, until their names too faded into the background of history. To imagine Alexander in his final days is to picture him lying on a couch in Babylon, his breath shallow, his body weakened. Around him, generals whispered, attendants fanned him, physicians offered remedies. Outside, the city hummed with life markets busy, temples crowded, soldiers drilling. But within, silence deepened. The once restless king lay still, his dreams unfinished, his conquests incomplete. His life, marked by ceaseless motion, had ended in stillness, yet his shadow lingered. Later, kings carried his image on coins, his stories in chronicles, his ambitions in their own plans. Even centuries later, his name evoked the idea of greatness, of might, of the rise and fall of kings. But the daily realities, the bread, the wine, the prayers, the councils, the weary marches were forgotten, left to imagination. And so, as sleep approaches, picture the rhythm of Alexander's days. Picture the dawn prayers, the steady march, the long councils, the endless feasts. Picture the dust of the roads, the flicker of campfires, the hush of night across strange lands. Picture the rise of a king who sought to be more than mortal, and the fall of a man who could not escape mortality. The rise and fall of mighty kings is not only in their triumphs, but in their routines, in the quiet repetition of their days. Alexander lived as others lived, bound by time, by duty, by the rhythm of morning and night. His empire dissolved, his successors faltered, but his story endures, soft and steady, like the flow of a river through the dark. The sun rose slowly over the plains of Persia, casting long golden rays across fields and mountains. In the heart of the empire, within palaces of stone and carved cedar, kings awoke to another day of ritual and rule. These were the great kings, the monarchs of Persia, who bore titles of majesty and carried the weight of vast dominions. Their reigns stretched across deserts, rivers, and mountains, uniting many peoples under one crown. Yet even for them, life followed a rhythm, steady and familiar, repeating itself day after day, season after season. The day of a Persian king began in silence. Attendants moved softly through the chambers, carrying vessels of bronze and silver, bringing water scented with rose and saffron. Curtains were drawn aside, letting in the pale light of morning. The king's body was washed, his hair combed, his beard oiled and trimmed. Robes of fine linen, dyed with indigo and scarlet, were draped upon his shoulders. Jewels adorned his fingers, a heavy torque encircled his neck, and on his brow rested a simple band of gold, less a crown than a symbol of continuity. Servants laid out food upon low tables, flatbreads warm from the ovens, bowls of dates and figs, honey thick and sweet, cheeses made from sheep's milk, roasted lamb seasoned with herbs, jugs of wine and bowls of water stood ready. The king ate sparingly, for ceremony lay ahead, and a ruler's strength was not shown in indulgence but in restraint. At dawn, the sacred fires were tended. Priests of the old Persian faith lifted their hands toward the rising sun, chanting prayers. In steady rhythm, flames flickered upon altars, fed with dry wood and fragrant incense. The king, standing apart yet central, bowed his head and recited words of devotion. For Persians believed their kings ruled not by chance, but by divine favor, granted by Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord of Heaven. Each prayer renewed that bond. Each offering secured the empire's fortune. Once the rituals ended, the day of governance began. Courtiers assembled in great halls, their garments bright with colors, their eyes lowered in deference. Petitioners were led forward, their voices steady but humble. Some sought judgments over land, others appealed for mercy, still others brought tribute from distant provinces. The king listened, his face composed, speaking few words, but each word carrying the weight of law. Messengers arrived from every corner of the empire, riders who had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and sailed rivers. They brought reports of distant satraps, governors who ruled in the king's name. They carried news of harvests, of taxes gathered, of rebellions threatened or suppressed. Scrolls were unrolled, seals broken, words read aloud. The king's scribes recorded replies, drafting commands, stamping orders with the royal seal. To govern an empire of such vastness required patience, attention, and endless repetition. Every day brought more reports, more judgments, more decrees. By midday, audiences gave way to councils of war and state. Generals unfurled maps upon tables of polished wood. They pointed to rivers, to mountains, to cities at the edges of the empire. They spoke of supplies, of numbers, of soldiers, of the movements of enemies. The king listened, his hand sometimes resting on his beard, sometimes pointing to a place upon the map. Decisions were made slowly, carefully, each word weighed. For a single command could send thousands to march, to fight, to die. After councils came feasts, though even these followed ritual. Tables stretched the length of great halls, covered with embroidered cloths, platters of roasted game, baskets of bread, bowls of pomegranates and melons filled the space. Wine was poured into golden cups, mixed with water, passed from hand to hand. Musicians played lyres and flutes, dancers moved in slow patterns, poets recited verses in honor of the king. Yet, amidst the laughter and song, the ruler remained steady, his place at the center constant. The afternoons were often devoted to processions or hunts. The king rode out in a chariot drawn by horses, their harnesses gilded, their manes braided. Behind him marched soldiers in armor of bronze and iron, their shields gleaming, their spears upright. Processions wound through city streets, reminding the people of the majesty of their ruler. At other times, the king rode to the fields for the hunt, loosing arrows at lions or boars. The chase was both sport and symbol, for, in conquering the beasts of the land, the king showed his strength to his people. As the sun lowered, the palace filled again with ritual. Lamps of bronze were lit, fires rekindled, incense burned. Priests recited prayers for protection through the night. The king washed once more, laying aside his heavy robes for lighter garments. He retired to chambers lined with carved reliefs, where images of kings before him looked down in silence. Attendants withdrew, leaving him to rest, night after night. This cycle repeated, rising, praying, judging, commanding, feasting, hunting, resting. The details might change with seasons or years, but the structure endured. Kings came and went, but the rhythm of their days remained. Yet even for the great kings, the cycle did not last forever. Rebellions grew, satraps turned ambitious, enemies pressed upon the borders. The weight of ruling such a vast realm wore heavily. Some kings became cautious, others indulgent, still others cruel. But all faced the same end. Their reigns ended, their crowns passed on, their names carved into stone, but their lives reduced to fragments of memory. When Alexander of Macedon marched east, the Persian kings discovered that grandeur could not shield them. Armies gathered, battles were fought, palaces burned. The empire that had stretched so far crumbled. Its kings remembered not for their daily lives, but for their defeat. Yet, even then, the routines of kingship did not vanish. The conqueror adopted them, the successors imitated them, and the rhythm endured. To imagine the evening of a Persian king is to picture him reclining upon a couch, the walls around him painted with scenes of battles and hunts. Servants pour wine, musicians play softly, the air filled with incense. Outside, the vast empire lies in darkness, its people sleeping, its provinces waiting for the next dawn. The king closes his eyes, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same prayers, the same judgments, the same cycle of rule. And, as centuries passed, the details of these lives faded. The food they ate, the words they spoke, the thoughts they carried into the night hall vanished. What remained was the image of majesty, the rise and fall of mighty kings, remembered not for their routines but for their crowns. Still, beneath the weight of history, those routines whisper. They tell of mornings washed in light, of bread shared, in silence, of prayers spoken at altars, of councils drawn out over maps, of feasts echoing with music, of nights ended in stillness. They tell of men who lived as all men live, who ruled as all rulers rule, who fell as all must fall. And so, as sleep approaches, picture the long halls of Persian palaces, the flicker of torches against carved stone, the low chant of priests, the measured steps of courtiers. Picture the steady rhythm of a king's day, repeated endlessly, until time itself wore it away. Picture the rise of an empire in morning light, and its fall into evening shadow. The rise and fall of mighty kings continues, as it always has. The kings of Persia rose in grandeur, ruled in ritual, and fell in silence. Their story, like all stories of kings, lingers in memory soft, distant, fading like the last glow of fire at night. The bells of a monastery rang softly in the distance, their tones carrying across the fields and into the stone walls of a medieval castle. Inside, the king stirred. The morning came not with trumpets or with sudden noise, but with the measured rhythm of servants moving quietly through dim corridors. Torches still burned low in sconces along the walls, their flames flickering against rough-hewn stone. Outside, the world was gray with mist, the fields damp with dew. The king's chamber was simple in some ways, elaborate in others. Heavy wooden beams supported the ceiling. The floor was covered with rushes, changed when they grew foul with dust and refuse. Against the walls stood carved chests filled with garments, wool tunics, cloaks trimmed with fur, belts studded with bronze. The bed itself was large, hung with curtains to keep out the cold. Within, the king lay upon a mattress stuffed with feathers, covered by blankets of wool and fur. Servants entered, careful not to speak loudly. They brought basins of water, cold from wells or streams. They laid out garments for the day, brushing away dust, smoothing folds. They prepared bread, cheese, and ale for a light morning meal. Sometimes the food was richer meat pies, honeyed cakes, but often it was plain. For medieval kings, like their people, lived with the rhythm of scarcity as much as plenty. The king rose slowly, stretching, washing his face in the cold water, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Attendants draped garments over his shoulders. A tunic of wool, perhaps dyed in crimson or blue, marked his station. A cloak fastened with a brooch, lined with fur for warmth. Boots of leather laced high, softened from wear. At his waist, a sword in its scabbard, not always used but always present. Upon his brow, if ceremony required it, a crown of gold, heavy, yet familiar. The first duty of the day was prayer. A chapel within the castle stood ready, its walls adorned with painted saints, its windows narrow slits that let in shafts of morning light. The king knelt before the altar, crossing himself, murmuring words of devotion. Priests intoned prayers in Latin, their voices low, their rhythm steady. Incense drifted upward, the smoke curling toward vaulted beams. The king bowed his head, repeating the responses, his lips moving in time with the ritual. Religion was not separate from his kingship, but bound to it, for the authority of medieval kings was said to come from God. Each morning prayer renewed that bond. After prayer came the business of governance. In the great hall of the castle, courtiers assembled. The hall was vast, its walls hung with tapestries depicting hunts, battles, and saints. A long table stretched across the room, benches lining either side. At the far end, upon a dais, stood the throne, chair of carved wood, gilded in places, cushioned with fabric. The king ascended, seated himself, and the hall quieted. Petitioners approached. Some were nobles with grievances, others peasants seeking relief, still others monks asking for privileges or exemptions. They knelt before the throne, speaking their cases. The king listened, sometimes leaning forward, sometimes resting back, always considering. He gave judgments in measured tones. His words were recorded by scribes, written upon parchment with ink and quill. The process was slow, deliberate, and repeated each day. Messengers brought news from the realm. Riders from distant shires carried letters sealed with wax, reports of taxes, of harvests, of disputes between lords, of bandits troubling roads. The king heard them all, gave orders, and entrusted ministers to carry them out. The weight of administration was heavy, yet the rhythm was unchanging. Reports received, decisions made, commands given. By midday, councils gathered. Nobles and bishops assembled around the king, their voices rising in debate. They spoke of alliances, of wars with neighboring realms, of marriages that might bind families together. They argued, sometimes fiercely, over rights and privileges. The king listened, intervened, and steered decisions. Yet even here, routine prevailed. The same disputes returned again and again, reshaped but familiar. Land law were the endless concerns of a medieval court. Meals followed, though even meals were ritualized. In the great hall, tables were set with trenchers of bread, upon which meats and stews were placed. Servants carried pitchers of ale and wine, pouring for the guests. The king sat at the high table, his portion more elaborate, but not entirely different from that of others. Roasted venison, boiled beef, salted fish, pies of poultry, all served in sequence. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger added variety, for such luxuries marked status. Music played softly, minstrels strummed, lutes, jesters entertained. Yet beneath the noise and laughter, the structure of the meal remained steady. Blessing before, service during, thanks after. The afternoons were often given to audiences or journeys. Sometimes the king rode out to inspect lands, visiting villages, listening to grievances. Sometimes he hunted, accompanied by nobles, hounds running ahead, horns sounding through forests. The hunt was both recreation and display of power, for to master the wilderness was to show mastery of the realm. At other times, the king received foreign envoys. They entered in procession, bowing deeply, bearing gifts of gold, silver, cloth, or exotic animals. Words were exchanged through interpreters, treaties signed, promises made. Evenings returned to prayer. In the chapel, candles flickered, chants echoed, incense filled the air once more. The king stood or knelt, weary from the day but bound to ritual. Afterward came the evening meal, lighter than at midday but still formal. Bread, cheese, and stewed fruits might be served, with cups of wine to warm the body against the night's chill. After supper, the king retired to smaller chambers. There by firelight he might listen to readings, chronicles of past kings, saints, lives or romances of knights and ladies. Scribes or clerics read aloud, their voices steady, their pace slow. The king listened, sometimes commenting, sometimes silent, letting the words wash over him. Stories filled the hours until drowsiness came. Finally, he withdrew to his chamber. Curtains were drawn around the bed. Servants laid fresh rushes, banked the fire, and departed quietly. The king lay down, pulling blankets close, the weight of the day heavy upon him. Outside, the castle settled into silence. Guards paced the walls, torches burned faintly, owls called in the night. The king closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same prayers, the same judgments, the same meals, the same counsels. The rhythm of medieval kingship was one of repetition, each day marked by ritual, each duty echoing the one before. The details might shift with seasons, harvest feasts, winter councils, summer hunts, but the cycle remained constant. Morning prayers, governance, councils, meals, hunts, evening prayers, readings, rest. Even in times of war, the rhythm persisted. The king rose in tents instead of castles, prayed before makeshift altars, judged disputes among soldiers instead of peasants, ate from campfires instead of feasting tables. But the structure remained. Orders given, reports received, meals taken, nights ended in silence. War added urgency, but not escape from repetition. As centuries passed, different kings came and went. Some were pious, rising early for prayer, fasting often, seeking guidance from monks. Others were indulgent, lingering in bed, feasting long, surrounding themselves with jesters and flatterers. Yet beneath these variations, the framework endured. Kings lived by routine, for without it, order crumbled. To imagine the life of a medieval king is not to picture endless glory, but endless duty. The weight of crowns pressed not only in moments of triumph, but in the monotony of daily acts. Bread broken, prayers spoken, judgments given, sleep taken. The cycle bound them as tightly as their subjects. And so, as you rest now, imagine the flicker of candles in stone chapels, the murmur of Latin prayers, the shuffle of servants carrying bread and ale. Imagine the steady rhythm of footsteps across flagstones, the low hum of voices in great halls, the soft rustle of rushes beneath boots. Imagine the slow, measured life of a king, not in splendor, but in repetition. The rise and fall of mighty kings continues, as it always has, in castles of stone, in halls of wood, on fields of battle, in chambers of rest. The rhythm of rule endures. And then, as always, it fades into silence, leaving only the memory of crowns and the echo of routine. The life of a medieval king did not remain bound within stone walls. Castles were centers of power, yet they were not the entirety of kingship. The kingdom stretched outward: villages, towns, forests, rivers, abbeys, monasteries, markets, roads. To govern such a realm, the king moved among it, slowly and deliberately, according to the rhythms of duty. When a king left his castle, it was never alone. Processions formed, long lines of riders and servants, banners carried high. The king at the center, seated upon a sturdy horse, cloaked against the weather. Behind him rode knights, their armor gleaming in sunlight or dulled by rain. Clerics accompanied, carrying books, relics, and letters. Servants brought provisions, bread, salted meat, wine casks, bundles of hay for horses. Wagons creaked under the weight of tents, bedding, and chests of documents. The king's court, portable and restless, stretched across the road like a moving village. The journey itself was slow. Roads were rough, often little more than dirt tracks, rutted by wheels and softened by mud. Bridges were scarce, so streams were forded on horseback. Weather could delay travel for days, when rains turned fields into marshes or snow-blocked narrow passes. Yet the rhythm endured. Each morning the king rose as he had in his castle, prayed, ate bread and cheese, mounted his horse, and rode onward. At midday a halt was called, fires were kindled, food was warmed, water fetched. In the evening tents were pitched, or hospitality sought in a monastery or a noble's hall. Wherever he went, the king received homage. In villages, peasants lined the roads, bowing as he passed, some offering baskets of grain, loaves of bread, or small coins. In towns, bells rang and guilds presented gifts. Nobles hosted feasts, setting tables with their finest meats and wines, eager to display loyalty. Monasteries opened their doors, chanting prayers for the king's health and salvation. These progresses across the land were more than ceremony. They were governance made visible. By showing himself, the king reminded his subjects of authority. By accepting gifts, he confirmed bonds of loyalty. By listening to petitions in distant shires, he ensured that his rule stretched beyond castle walls. The journey itself was part of the work of kingship, yet beyond ceremony lay endless negotiations. The realm was never entirely peaceful. Nobles guarded their rights fiercely, monks defended privileges, merchants sought freedoms. The king stood at the center of disputes. In castles and abbeys, he sat in councils where voices clashed. One lord claimed a boundary of land, another countered with documents and witnesses. Monks requested exemption from taxes. Townsmen demanded fairer tolls on roads and markets. The king heard all, weighed arguments, and gave judgment. Each decision bound him tighter into the web of obligations. Feudal order depended on these ties. Kings granted lands to lords in return for service. Lords, in turn, granted parcels to knights. Knights protected peasants who tilled fields and paid dues. Each link supported the next, but each link also strained with tension. The king's duty was not only to command, but to balance between powerful nobles, between church and crown, between justice and mercy. The balancing never ended, and it returned in cycles, dispute after dispute, season after season. The church stood as both partner and rival. Bishops sat in councils, abbots advised in chambers, popes wrote letters heavy with demands. Kings sought blessing from the church, for their crowns were sanctified by holy oil, their rule justified as divine. Yet kings also struggled against clerical power. Disputes arose over who might appoint bishops, over taxes on monasteries, over jurisdiction in law. Priests claimed souls, kings claimed bodies, and between them lay endless negotiation. In times of peace, such disputes filled the king's days. In times of war, new rhythms took hold. War did not end repetition, it rearranged it. At dawn, horns called soldiers to arms. Camps stirred with the sound of boots, the clatter of pots, the creak of wagons. The king, armored and mounted, rode along the lines, banners fluttering above. He spoke words of encouragement, reminding men of loyalty, of duty, of faith. Then came marches across fields, sieges before stone walls, long weeks of waiting as engines hurled stones and fires burned. Even war contained monotony. Watches posted, fires tended, food rationed, prayers said at dusk. Days blurred into nights, punctuated by skirmishes and negotiations. Victory, when it came, was not always glorious. It was often followed by treaties, renewed disputes, and the same slow return to councils and petitions. Throughout it all, the king remained the pivot. His seal on parchment gave law. His word in council ended debate. His presence in villages reminded peasants of order. His prayers in chapels reassured clerics of piety. Without him, the realm risked fracture, for kingship in the Middle Ages was as much performance as power. Yet behind this weight lay a human figure, subject to the same needs as all others. A king tired upon long journeys, felt the cold of rain, struggled to rest upon straw-filled mattresses in tents. He grew weary of disputes, impatient with delays, yet continued because kingship allowed no pause. The crown was not worn only on feast days. It pressed upon the brow in each moment of each day. As seasons turned, so too did the cycle of duties. Spring brought journeys to fields to ensure planting was done. Summer brought hunting, both for sport and for training nights. Autumn brought councils on harvest and taxes. Winter brought indoor feasts, long prayers, and negotiations by firelight. Year after year, the cycle returned, binding the king to rhythms larger than himself. The people, too, saw kingship in cycles. They knew the king as distant figure, glimpsed rarely, yet spoken of often. His name invoked in prayers, his face stamped on coins, his image painted in manuscripts. When he passed through a town, peasants knelt, children stared, old men murmured blessings. For them, the king was at once far and near, far in daily life, near in moments of ceremony. In this way, the life of a medieval king was shaped less by triumph than by constancy. Duties returned, petitions repeated, councils reconvened. Each day resembled the last, each season echoed the one before. The crown did not free the king from monotony. It bound him more tightly to it. And so, as evening returned, after long journeys and long councils, the king retired once more to chambers or tents. Servants lit candles, set out bread and wine, brought warm water for washing. Clerics read from psalms, their voices low and steady. The king listened, nodding, sometimes closing his eyes. He lay down upon his bed, whether feather mattress in a castle or straw pallet in a tent. Outside, guards stood watch, torches flickered. The world grew quiet. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythms again, prayers at dawn, councils at midday, meals at appointed hours, disputes unending, journeys resumed. Kingship was not escape from the ordinary, yet was the ordinary multiplied, stretched across a realm, repeated without end. The rise and fall of mighty kings continued, not in moments of glory alone, but in the slow, steady beat of duty. The crown endured because the rhythm endured, day after day, night after night, until silence closed over one king and opened for the next. The crowning of a medieval king was not a single event, but the beginning of a lifelong ritual. From the moment oil touched his forehead, he was no longer merely a man. He became a figure set apart, woven into the sacred order of the world. Yet, like every other aspect of kingship, the grandeur of ceremony rested upon repetition chants, spoken again and again, gestures repeated from reign to reign, symbols reused until their meaning blurred into habit. The coronation began at dawn. Bells rang across the city, echoing through narrow streets and over market squares. People gathered, some curious, others reverent, all eager to witness. Nobles dressed in their finest cloaks, bishops in embroidered vestments, knights in polished armor. The air filled with the scent of incense, the sound of chanting, the murmur of expectation. The king himself prepared quietly. He bathed as ritual demanded. He fasted as tradition required. He prayed, kneeling before an altar, listening as priests whispered ancient words. His garments were plain at first, for splendor came later. A tunic of white, symbol of purity. Over it, a cloak, red for sacrifice, blue for faith, or gold for majesty. Each color carried meaning, though the meaning was repeated so often that few questioned it. At the appointed hour, the procession formed. The king walked slowly toward the great church, flanked by nobles and clergy. Crowds pressed near, straining to see, their voices hushed. Inside the church, candles burned, filling the air with smoke. Choirs sang hymns that echoed. Walls, the bishop, waiting at the altar, held the crown upon a cushion. The ritual unfolded, step by step. Oaths were sworn to defend the church, to uphold justice, to protect the poor. The king placed his hand upon sacred texts, repeating words spoken by generations before him. Then came the anointing, the most solemn moment. Oil, perfumed and consecrated, was poured upon his head, traced upon his forehead, sometimes upon his chest and hands. With that act, the king became more than ruler. He became chosen. The oil marked him as sacred, as one set apart, even as he remained human. Next came the investiture, the sword, symbol of defense, the scepter, symbol of authority, the orb, symbol of dominion. Each object placed in his hands with words of explanation, words spoken so many times that they became as steady as the ticking of a clock. Finally, the crown itself, lifted high, lowered gently, set upon his head. At that moment, trumpets sounded, bells rang, voices rose. The people cried out, "Long live the king!" The coronation ended not in silence, but in feasting. Tables groaned. Under roasted meats, loaves of bread, jugs of wine, nobles pledged loyalty, bishops offered blessings, minstrels sang songs of glory. Yet beneath the surface lay the same rhythms of obligation. Every oath spoken bound the king. Every gesture tied him into patterns already centuries old. The ceremony seemed glorious, but it was also deeply monotonous. Each king, crowned as his predecessors had been, each word repeated as though time itself required it. Once crowned, the king's life became a series of rituals. Each feast followed. Order grace spoken before meals, dishes served in sequence, toasts raised in turn. Each council began with formal greetings, prayers for wisdom, invocations of saints. Each judgment in court required precise words, careful gestures, seals pressed in wax. The very language of kingship was repetitive, its strength drawn not from novelty but from familiarity. When the king appeared in public, his movements were deliberate. He raised his hand in blessing, a gesture learned and practiced. He touched relics, bowed before altars, laid gifts upon shrines. Crowds expected these actions, and he gave them what they expected. To deviate was dangerous, to repeat was safe. Thus kingship became performance, staged again and again. Even warfare carried ritual. Banners raised before battle, prayers spoken before charges, oaths renewed before campaigns. Soldiers cheered, knights knelt, chaplains blessed. The rhythm of war echoed, the rhythm of coronation, solemn words, repeated acts, gestures carried forward. The king's court itself was a theater of symbols, thrones carved with lions or crosses, robes lined with fur, seals marked with eagles, lilies, or leopards. Heralds cried titles in long sequences, repeating them until they lost meaning. Each object, each word, each sound reminded subjects that the king was not only man but symbol. And yet, for the king, the repetition dulled meaning. What had once been sacred became routine. The church reinforced this rhythm. Kings were expected to attend Mass daily, to hear psalms sung at regular hours, to receive communion on holy days. Monks copied prayers into books. Bishops reminded kings of duties. Clerics urged charity. The cycle of the liturgical year guided royal life. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, each marked with ceremony. For the king, these holy rhythms merged with political ones until life itself became a long sequence of oaths and blessings. In the evenings, ceremonies softened into smaller rituals. Candles lit, prayers spoken at bedsides, clerics reading softly from scriptures. Servants folded garments, placed crowns upon cushions, set aside scepters in chests. The king lay down, his body weary, his mind heavy. Tomorrow would bring the same gestures, again the same blessings, the same oaths, the same performances. Over time, these rituals blurred into memory. One coronation resembled another. One feast echoed another. One war followed the pattern of all wars. The cycle of ceremony gave stability, but it also revealed the monotony of kingship. To rule was not only to command armies or issue decrees. It was to perform the same sacred drama, endlessly repeated, until the crown passed to another head. And yet, this repetition gave kingship its endurance. Subjects believed not because each king was unique, but because each resembled the last. The rituals reassured, the ceremonies calmed, the oaths bound. Kings rose, kings fell, but the rhythm continued. As you listen now, imagine the great church filled with smoke and song, the slow procession of a king toward the altar, the oil poured, the crown lowered. Imagine the feasts, the councils, the judgments, the endless sequence of gestures and words. Imagine how heavy repetition must have felt, how wearying ceremony must have become. And then, as sleep approaches, imagine the silence that follows. The church emptied, the feasts ended, the council dismissed, the crown set aside for the night, the torches extinguished, the king asleep, the realm quiet. Tomorrow the ritual will begin again, as it always has, as it always will. The rise and fall of mighty kings is not measured only in battles and conquests, but in the slow weight of ceremony, repeated until meaning fades into rhythm, and rhythm fades into silence. A crown, once lifted onto the head of a young king, seemed to promise permanence. Yet crowns were heavy things, not only in gold and jewels, but in duty and worry. With each year that passed, the weight pressed harder. The life of a medieval king was not only ceremony and triumph, but also strain of rule, strain of age, strain of being both man and symbol. In the beginning, kings ruled with vigor. They rode swiftly, hunted tirelessly, feasted long into the night. Their words carried certainty, their decisions conviction. But time is patient, and kingship was endless repetition. Each petition heard, each council convened, each judgment made, each ceremony performed, drained, little by little. What once seemed grand became weary routine. What once seemed sacred became tedious duty. Illness visited even kings. Coughs lingered, fevers burned, joints stiffened with cold winters. Physicians offered potions of herbs. Prayers were spoken by monks. Relics touched to foreheads. Some kings recovered, many did not. The body that once bore armor grew heavy. The hands that once gripped swords trembled. Still, the crown demanded presence, demanded repetition. A sick king remained king, even when he longed only for rest. Loneliness also grew in the chambers of power. Kings were surrounded always by servants, by courtiers, by guards. Yet true solitude pressed more deeply in crowded halls. Few spoke honestly to a king. Flattery filled the air. Loyalty was proclaimed loudly. But beneath words lay ambition. Nobles sought favor. Clerics sought privilege. Merchants sought wealth. Even family ties were uncertain, for brothers might scheme, sons might rebel, wives might plot for their children. The crown isolated even as it drew crowds. Suspicion was constant. Messages whispered in corridors. Letters carried in secret. Alliances formed in shadows. Kings learned to watch faces, to weigh words, to listen for silence more than sound. Trust was rare, betrayal common. A smile at council might hide a sword at night. A toast at feast might precede a plot. The loneliness of kingship was not absence of company, but absence of certainty. Decline also came in the realm itself. Taxes pressed heavily, harvests failed, wars dragged on. People grumbled in villages, nobles muttered in castles, monks wrote criticisms in chronicles. A king who once seemed mighty might, in later years, seemed burdensome. Songs of praise gave way to murmurs of discontent. The same crown that had shone in youth now seemed tarnished by age. Rebellion was never far. Peasants might rise, wielding scythes and clubs. Nobles might gather armies, claiming defense of custom. Rivals might march under banners, declaring rightful rule. Each rebellion was a test, sometimes crushed swiftly, sometimes dragging on for years. Each rebellion left scars burned, villages, emptied treasuries, shaken loyalties. Even when victory came, it carried exhaustion. For some kings, decline came in deposition. Crowns taken, thrones emptied, rulers exiled or imprisoned. The mighty reduced to captives, guarded in towers, remembered in whispers. The ritual of coronation was mirrored by the ritual of downfall. Crowns removed, oaths broken, names erased. What began in grandeur often ended in silence. Yet, even without rebellion, decline pressed quietly. The mind wearied, the body weakened, the will faltered. A king might sit upon his throne, listening to disputes, hearing voices drone, struggling to keep his eyes open. Feasts that once delighted became burdens. Hunts that once thrilled became tiring. Ceremonies once majestic became tedious. The rhythm of kingship, once steady, became suffocating, and always death approached. No crown could prevent it, no scepter could delay it. Priests reminded kings to prepare souls, monks copied prayers for dying rulers, physicians prescribed last drafts of herbs. Kings who commanded thousands faced death, as all men did quietly, in chambers lit by candles, surrounded by murmurs of prayer. The crown might rest upon a cushion nearby, gleaming faintly, awaiting another head. The loneliness of death for kings was profound. Courtiers waited for inheritance. Nobles prepared oaths for the next ruler. Servants whispered of what would come. The dying king, once surrounded by crowds, now found himself surrounded by anticipation, not devotion. Even as prayers were whispered, thoughts turned forward to the next reign, the next cycle, the next performance. And when death came, it was absorbed into repetition. Bells tolled, masses said, bodies wrapped, funerals held, nobles wept in form, clergy sang in ritual, peasants murmured in habit. The king became memory, the crown moved onward. What had seemed so mighty ended in silence, broken only by the cry of "Long live the king," now directed to another. Yet even in decline, the daily life of kingship remained steady. Bread eaten at dawn, councils at noon, feasts at night. Even as strength faded, the rituals did not. The crown demanded presence to the last, demanded repetition to the end. Kings lived in ceremony, ruled in routine, and died in ritual. To imagine the decline of a medieval king is to imagine weariness spread across years, each step slower, each feast shorter, each judgment heavier, the body weakening, the mind clouding, the crown pressing harder. Yet still the rhythms continued unbroken until the silence of death. As you rest now, picture a king seated in dim chambers, fire burning low, courtiers distant. His crown rests beside him, heavy and unused. He closes his eyes, listening to murmured prayers, feeling the slow weight of years. Tomorrow may not come for him, but tomorrow will come for the crown. Another head will bear it, another life will repeat the cycle. The rise and fall of mighty kings is not only in triumph and ceremony, but in decline and loneliness. Crowns are heavy, thrones are cold, and kingship, though mighty, is fragile. Yet the rhythm endures through repetition, through ceremony, through silence.